For us, I can't say that we ever really thought that much about adoption, honestly, before we started the process. It wasn't something that I had dreamed about all my life or I'd thought about much, but I hadn't ruled it out either. I think we probably assumed that we would have biological children, and if we weren't able to, then we would be happy to look at adoption. Peter is the pastor of a church in North Edinburgh. That's where we are. And it's in one of the most deprived housing schemes in Scotland. It's called West Pilton. There's a lot of deprivation and addiction and abuse. And one of the first things that we got involved with after moving there was to volunteer at a local food bank as a way to get to know people in the community. And it was there that I met Laura. It's not her real name, but we'll call her Laura. She was in her early 20s and her partner was a drug dealer in our scheme. He was about 20 years older than Laura, and he was aggressive and he was controlling. Together they had a little boy who was 2, who was on the child protection register, so he was at risk of being removed due to concerns over his dad's lifestyle and also Laura's ability to keep him safe. She was also 4 months pregnant, which social work didn't know. So I was able to attend her social work meetings with her, which was a real blessing. And every time without fail, at every meeting, she was encouraged to leave her partner, but she never did. She knew that it probably would be better for her and her son, but that would mean she was a single parent and she was alone and vulnerable. One social work meeting I remember was especially rough for her. It was a meeting where she was going to learn if the child was going to be removed from her care or not, her son. And I remember walking to the social work centre with her that morning, and she was so terrified and so worked up, she just had to keep stopping, and she just kept throwing up in the street. And people were just staring at us. I'm sure they probably thought she was wasted, but she was just terrified. So it was decided at that meeting that she was going to be able to keep her son, but with very strict conditions in place. And it was a huge relief for her, but it didn't feel like a celebration. Her stress levels and anxiety were at an all-time high as we walked home. So I called in with her later that afternoon, and she was sitting in her flat by herself in the dark drinking a bottle of wine. She was 4 months pregnant, remember? And it was during that conversation she told me that her mum had rented her out to men from the age of 6. So 4 months later, she gave birth to a little girl, and she brought her round to our house to meet her. And on seeing her, I could immediately tell that she had fetal alcohol syndrome from her facial features due to exposure to alcohol in the womb. And I tried to celebrate with her. I held the baby. I was happy with her. I congratulated her, of course, but my heart just sank. I just thought my friend wasn't able to care for one baby, never mind 2. She couldn't even care for herself. And where would she ever have learned how to do that? How would she ever have learned how to care for a child? All she'd been taught from her mum is that the only value that she had was in making her money. And Laura didn't want to be the kind of mum that she had had. She loved her kids. She was trying to fight for them in the only way that she knew how. But she'd never learned even the most basic of parenting skills. So throw into the mix a toddler who had never been taught boundaries, and a new baby that was going to that had a condition that's going to make managing their behaviour very difficult. And there's very little chance outside of Jesus that Laura's children are going to turn out any differently than she has. Their story, going back at least 3 generations, and that's just what I know of, is sexual abuse, drugs, crime, and social services. And sadly, Laura's story, where we live and minister, is the rule and not the exception. I could tell you lots more stories just like these. Childhood abuse is really heartbreakingly common, and it leads just to generation after generation of mess, and it's a cycle that never gets broken. And it's that made me realise, going to social work meetings with these women, that made me realise that the experiences that you're exposed to as a child, humanly speaking, set the whole trajectory of a person's life. So I started thinking, what if we could change that for a child? I wasn't naive enough to think that we could undo damage that had already been done, or that adoption would undo experiences that they'd been exposed to pre-birth or as young children. But what if we could minimize those harmful experiences that these children are exposed to, and instead show them that Jesus' life and death could mean that we can have eternal life. So we started talking and praying about adoption. I remember the night across the dinner table, I asked Peter, what do you think about adoption? And he said, I can't think of a reason to say no. And that is pretty much how it went. I don't have a magical story of how God told us yes, except that he didn't tell us no. And we began to see more and more that as Christians, we'd actually already been called to adoption. We'd already been called to look after orphans. Over 40 times, in fact, in the Bible. We say often that if you see God repeating himself in the Bible, it's really important. It means something to him. So we can see over 40 mentions of it that orphans really matter to God. So for us, really, it came down to here is a need and we can meet it. So 8.5 years ago, we made our first call to an adoption agency. We went through the process. It's a long process. There's a lot involved in it. But long story short, 15 months later, our first daughter came home, aged 17 months. So we didn't set out to grow our family only by adoption. That's just where God has led us to, one step at a time. But when our eldest daughter was about 3, we started thinking again about what was next for our family. Would we think about adopting again, or would we try for a biological child? And the more we prayed about it, the more we began to appreciate God's covenant in a new way. I think as I was praying about it, I couldn't get past the word covenant. That's what kept coming to me. That's what I feel God kept bringing to me. And my thinking was that if we had a birth child, they would automatically be brought under God's covenant. And by that in the Bible, when we talk about a covenant, it's a promise that God is our God, but also a God to our children. And that is a totally amazing privilege to be born under God's covenant. But by adopting, we'd be changing something. Adoption's taking a child from outside of God's covenant and bringing them into God's covenant. And that is a really incredible thing, because earthly speaking, there is no other way besides adoption for that to happen. Not only is this child being given an earthly place of belonging, but they're also being given something so much bigger, and that is a covenant, a promise that he will be the God to us and a God to our children. So we started the adoption process again, and the next year our youngest daughter came home, aged 8 months. There's a lot that we didn't know about adoption then, and God is good. Barbara, I'm sure you can contest to this as well. God's good to not show us the future and everything that you're going to face. It has been wonderful, and it has been the hardest thing that we've ever done, and I'm sure that will continue. I am homeschooling, which I definitely did not set out to do, but our eldest has additional needs, which makes school really tricky for her. Our youngest is tube fed, and she has quite a lot of other medical issues. And I've taken on roles that I would never have foreseen in my life. I've had to become a teacher and a nurse and a researcher and an advocate and an expert on certain conditions. And I wasn't any of these things whenever God first chose to use us. So I wouldn't say there was anything about us that made us especially equipped to adopt. And I just want to encourage you that you don't have to be especially equipped. I'm struck by the fact that in the Bible, the first adopter is Pharaoh's daughter. She's God's enemy. She wasn't equipped. She just saw a need and she met it. She was willing. So adoption is scary and it's full of unknowns, and it still is. Even when the adoption has happened, that sense of fear and uncertainty is still there, and I have to fight it. But we just need to be willing to meet the need. I don't know if you live in a community like we live in, where the need is right in front of your face when you walk out the front door, but child abuse is happening, whether we see it or not. And it might be better hidden in your community, it might not. But for Christians, the lives and safety of children cannot be an out of sight and out of mind issue. The needs are too great and the stakes are too high. I don't think adoption and fostering is for every Christian couple. I think there are legitimate circumstances that would maybe not make it a good fit, but I am convinced that it's for more than the few who are currently doing it. And I can say that with conviction because there's still thousands of kids in the foster care system. So, like I said, I don't feel like you need to wait until you feel especially equipped or called. Peter and I, our talks has overlapped a lot, and we didn't know that. We didn't know what each other had written until the car journey on the way here yesterday, by which stage it was too late to change anything. But we both really feel, we want to challenge this idea of feeling called. The calling to look after orphans is there. It's in the Bible. It's already being spoken over and over again. So I think my challenge would be this: have you specifically asked God to show you how you can meet the need of orphans? I think from what I've observed in the church, and I've had many conversations about adoption because it's the thing that I feel most passionate about, but I think what I see is a pattern that generally we rule ourselves out until we feel ruled in by circumstances, and that's probably mostly fertility, or until we feel our calling. Maybe we're waiting for writing in the sky, maybe we're waiting for some sign from God, but I've become convinced that we've actually got that the wrong way round. And I think that we should assume that we are called until God tells us that we're not. And like I said, adoption and fostering is not for every Christian, but orphan care in some way it's got to look like something. Maybe it's adoption and fostering. Maybe it's kinship care, where you're looking after a member of your family. Maybe it's child sponsorship. Maybe it's volunteering with an organisation like Safe Families or Room for You, like Peter was talking about. Maybe it's really being intentional and seeking out ways that you can support adoptive and fostering families. It will look different, but it does take a village. It's too big a job for a family to do it on their own without a huge network of support. And I am confident that God will show you what your role is if you ask him. You also don't have to wait until you feel fearless, because God leads us into places that are sometimes absolutely terrifying. How many times do we see that in the Bible? He doesn't promise us an easy life or a life of safety or security. In fact, he promises that the opposite will be the case. But I can also tell you that there is no situation that he will abandon you in. There will be nothing that your child will do, and no condition that your child will suffer from, where his promise to be a God to you and your children will come untrue. I can testify, in fact, that we know his promises to be stronger, and his love to be deeper, and the saving gospel of adoption to mean more to us than it ever would have if this wasn't our journey. It's really constantly amazed me how he's just answered time and time again in such individual and specific ways, just through such tailored provision for our girls again and again. Like I've said, they both have extra needs. Barbara's going to talk about FASD, fetal alcohol spectrum disorder. Both of our girls have FASD. So they have extra needs, but God has given extra grace. And I also just feel like he gives us the best. It's just brought me to tears over and over again to see how he has provided for them in ways that have been better than we ever could have asked or imagined. He has taken away every obstacle and barrier that we faced, because there's a lot of hoops to jump through. There's a lot of fighting to be done, isn't there, Barbara? It's never ending. There's a lot of advocacy, but I just feel like he takes away every obstacle. And it's like he's saying, and we can maybe be uncomfortable hearing this, but I feel like such a sense of his pleasure in this journey. It's like he is saying, I like what you're doing. I love adoption. It's my whole heart. Don't become weary in doing good. At the right time, you'll reap a harvest if you don't give up. So no matter how hard or complex that it is, it will be forever worth it, because we have our children. But more than that, because of how this journey has deepened our faith in God and in his character and in his promises and his provision. And that is what our hope is in. It's not in our hope isn't in the fact that our children will be saved and be Christians. That is what I pray for more than anything else, but I can't make that happen. And anything that's not a sure thing is no hope. It's not a hope. So that's not what our ultimate hope is in. Our ultimate hope is in Jesus, who never changes and always, always gives us his best. That's a little bit about just our story and how God called us to adoption. I have a few little points about how the church can welcome fostered and adopted children for James and Katie, but I hope that they won't be the only family that foster or adopt. And I know that you have a kinship care situation in church, so you will have looked after children in your church, hopefully. So I'm sorry that this is a bit of a do's and don'ts list. That's never a fun talk to listen to, but here we are. My first one, is to treat adopted children like birth children in terms of status and acceptance and love and belonging. That story that Peter was talking about where the judge was saying he's no longer your adopted son, he's just your son. That is so right and so true. I would never introduce our children as these are my adopted children. I would just say these are my children. Because they are forever and completely a part of our family. But be careful even in your language. After we adopted our youngest one, I remember somebody in the church, not our congregation, but the wider church, saying to me, "Would you not think of having your own?" I don't think it was meant offensively, but it's offensive, honestly. They are my own. And it was kind of an insinuation that our family's not yet complete unless we have biological children. So these children are our own. When James and Katie adopt, their child will be their child, not Thomas and Luke is their biological child and this is their adoptive child. They will just all be their children. And if we believe in the theology of adoption, then we need to apply that to earthly adoption too. So treat adopted children like birth children is my first point. And my second point is, don't treat adopted children like birth children. So let me clarify. A few things. Don't ask a child's birth history. We've been asked it many times. And I don't think people are doing it to be nosy necessarily. And I think there's something in us that just loves a good rescue story. They like to compare where a child has come from to where they are. But can you imagine somebody coming up to you, maybe even somebody that you don't have a relationship with, and saying, "Can you tell me every dark and traumatizing thing that you've ever gone through?" That's not your business. That story belongs to the child, and if parents choose to pass that information on for the purpose of their child being better understood, then that needs to be within the context of a safe and trusted relationship. So our responses had to be, a lot of times, that's not information that we're sharing with people. So just save yourself an awkward conversation and don't ask. My second point is be trauma informed. I think Barbara's going to talk a little bit about trauma, but I just think it's really essential for the church to be trauma informed. Recognizing that all children who have been separated from their biological parents, and especially their mother, have suffered trauma and loss. All children who have ever been in care have experienced trauma. And it is a mistake to think that just because a child has been adopted from a very young age, that they won't suffer the effects of that in their brain and in their body. Trauma is not limited only to children who have been neglected or abused. Even if a child has lived with their adopted family from the day that they are born, the very act of being separated from their mother, who they have literally been at one flesh with, causes physiological changes in a child's brain. And neither of our girls can remember their birth parents, but the marks of being separated from them lingers and will linger. And children aren't able to articulate trauma. They don't sit down and say, "Mom, I'm feeling a bit traumatized today," or "I'm feeling a bit insecure. Is there a chance that I'm going to lose you as a parent? Is this going to be my forever home?" Those words don't come out their mouth. It just looks like really bad behavior a lot of the time. It will more likely look like as we've had really disrupted behaviour after reading a certain book with a storyline of orphans, or as we've had Cinderella, where the storyline is Cinderella's mum dies. We had a really bad day after that. That was a real trigger for our daughter. It might be a response to a loud noise, because children who are exposed to domestic violence in the womb are then very sensitive to loud noises, because that's a trigger for them, even though they will never have a memory of what specifically has happened. So these are all signs and symptoms of trauma. And not all children will have additional needs. The reality is that when you adopt children, a lot of them have been exposed to drugs and alcohol in the womb, and that has an effect on a child's brain. But not all of them will have additional needs. But all children who have been in care will come with trauma. So it's vital that the church is really informed about that, and it's an essential part of being an adoption and fostering friendly church. Recognise that behaviour is communication, and it's most likely a brain issue and not a heart issue. Though sometimes a heart issue, because they're wretched sinners just like us. But many adoptive children have got additional needs. They've been removed from their parents for a reason. Like I said, drugs and alcohol in the womb leave a mark that forever changes a child's brain. So things like ADHD and FASD, fetal alcohol, autism, sensory processing disorder, these are all common conditions that adoptive children will have. They are much more prevalent among adopted children than in the normal population. And domestic violence in the womb, things like that. And church might be really hard for some children. It can be a really tricky experience. It's noisy, like this hall is echoey. In the church, before a service, you're all speaking to each other. That's a lot of background noise going on at once. There's singing, that's noisy. If you're in a different church, your church might have a band, that's noisy. That can all be very disruptive, actually, for a child who has sensory processing needs. So just recognise that church can actually be really tricky for children. And having a quiet space away from everybody else might be really helpful for kids, if for them to go to if they're feeling overwhelmed. Also, just recognise that you don't know what a child has been exposed to, so be very slow to judge behaviour. Church services might look very differently for these kids. Our kids are certainly not sitting making notes during the sermon. They're spinning around in circles. That's why we sit at the back, so we don't disrupt anybody. But they need that in order to get the sensory feedback, in order to just keep themselves calm and regulated, and I'm totally fine with that. But just take your cue from their parents and make them feel valued and accepted, just as they are, without any expectations or opinions. And recognise too that church can be really hard work for parents. It's a joy, but it's the hardest part of my week. Peter's up at the front and I've got both kids, and they both have different needs. I'm trying to tube feed and the other one's spinning around or climbing over the seats, and it's not a moment of calm in my week, that's for sure. But what is really helpful is when people come and sit beside me and ask how they can help me, and just engage with the kids and read with them, or take the kids out for movement breaks, which we also need during church. That is all really helpful. Being practically helpful in ways like that, but for you guys in the first few weeks of adoption, so whenever James and Katie's child comes home, the most helpful thing you can do is stay away from them, and that is hard, and that's maybe not a nice thing to hear, but those first few weeks is really crucial for developing attachment and bonding, for them to bond as a family, because that child is learning for the first time that this is home, this is forever, and that James and Katie are their parents and Thomas and Luke are their brothers. Social workers call this funneling. So until a child develops an attachment with their parents, the circle is kept very small, and then gradually it will get bigger. And if children have had multiple moves, multiple homes, they won't have a sense of just having one place to belong. Everything has been temporary up to this point, and it will take them a long time to learn that this isn't temporary too. So they need to learn that this is home, and forever, and that mum and dad hold a role that other people don't hold. And this is actually really hard in a church, in a lovely close-knit church, because a massive strength of the church is that, in a sense, everybody belongs to each other. We're a family, and that is lovely. But I know that you'll want to be straight in there and picking them up and loving them, but it'll have to wait. Ask James and Katie what they're ready for, and just go really slowly. I know for us it was really helpful to have meals delivered or lovely gifts delivered, but it wasn't a visit. It was dropped off outside the door with a text saying it's outside the door, and that was really nice. So don't be tempted to pick a child up whenever they first come. If they're hurt, I know of course our response to a hurt child is to comfort them, but just direct them to James and Katie as mum and dad, so that the child is learning that they meet their needs and nobody else. A little bit further down the line, I know for us, the thing that I have craved the most has been respite. And respite, when you have kids with extra needs and complexities, is nearly impossible to get, because basically people need trained to look after your child. It's not a case of just dropping your child with a friend. It's just much more complicated than that. So that takes real intentionality on the part of church and friends to be that person that can provide that. And for us to get to that point with somebody, we really needed to be able to trust them. We needed to be confident that they understand our child and the way that their brain works, or the way that their brain doesn't work. The people that have been those ones are the ones that really have faithfully walked this journey with us. Not asking nosy questions, but asking, how can I specifically pray for the girls? How can I meet the needs of your girls? What do I need to know? Teach me about this. I remember one time, not that long ago, last year, I went to a soft play with a woman from our church who is a respite foster carer, but a very new respite foster carer. Single woman. We arranged to meet up on a Saturday morning. She had her little girl with her that she had for the weekend, and I was bringing our girls. And like I said, our youngest one is tube fed. She vomits a lot, and she had vomited in the car on the way there, so she was covered in vomit when we got to soft play. And I was paying to get into soft play, and she vomited all over me as I was giving the lady her money. So I sat down opposite my friend. I nearly said her name. My youngest daughter was covered in vomit. I was covered in vomit, and I just could have cried my eyes out, honestly. And what she said to me was, teach me how to feed your daughter, how to do the tube feeds, because you need a break. And in that moment, there was nothing better that anybody could have said to me. I'm going to cry just thinking about it. So it was just, she saw a need, and it wasn't I'll pray for you, which of course is helpful, but what I really needed was somebody to just help, and she helped. And so she came round to our house several times to learn to feed. She was signed off by a community nurse, and so she was able to provide respite for us, because she needs feeds or fluids through her tube every 2 hours, and so that would never give us an opportunity to have respite. But because she learned to feed her, she was able to take her, and that was just a gift. So just listen to adoptive families, listen to foster families, be really intentional in your questions, pray for them really regularly and specifically and knowledgeably, because adoption is spiritual war. It is warfare, and that's a whole other talk, but we need real specific prayers from people. So ask questions in the context of a safe and committed relationship, and pray for us. I'd say my greatest cheerleader and encourager is my best friend, who's not an adopter. She's just a really good listener, and she is really intentional about our conversations and what she asks me, and how she listens, and how she prays for me, and how she asks about specific hospital appointments that we've had, or things that she knows is coming up. And she's just encouraged me to look to Jesus and not to milestones or results. But also the reality is she wouldn't be able to do that if she was an adopter, because she wouldn't have the energy. Isn't that right, Barbara? The people that can relate most are not actually the people that are in a position to really be hands-on, practically helpful. Because it just takes, parenting is hard. It takes everything you've got. Adoption adds another layer of complexity to that, and additional needs adds more. So she has just been, she's my best friend because she's just the biggest help to me. And she isn't able to relate specifically, but she really makes an effort to enter our world. And that has been a gift as well. I think just also recognizing that fostering and adoption comes with a huge sense of loss, and especially foster carers. You can have a child for years sometimes, and then they leave, and that is such a grieving process. I know Caroline has fostered for years, and she's committed herself to so many children, and then they've moved on, and that is really difficult. Pray for her in her current role. Ask her, whatever she wants to tell you, ask her about it, be interested. Ask her how it's going, ask her how you can pray for her. Be confidential. Don't pass on any information. Arm yourself with knowledge, like blogs, like books. Home for Good is a good book written by Krish Kandaya. That is a very good starting point for adoption. And lastly, just be yourselves. We've been here recently, Peter and I. Peter's an elder here. We know you a little bit as a congregation. And so just keep being the warm and loving congregation that you are. Because I know that you are and will continue to be great church family for adoptive children. Keep being the aunties and uncles that you are to all of the children that God has put in your church.